And a very good evening to you, and welcome to Politics 101 on a Monday evening. We start off the week. It's going to be a busy week. So we start off with the topic Forbes Burnham at 100 years. Today, the 20th of February, he would have been 100 years that he lived. Died relatively young. He was just 62 when he died almost 38 years ago. And so tonight we are going to take a look at his significance. I suppose most of us would have some sense of his biography. So we're going to spend the time to ask what is his significance to our Guyana, our post-colonial experience. I, of course, would argue that Forbes Burnham, Cheddi Jagan, A.U.C. Guyana, and Walter Rodney have been the four leaders who have had the greatest impact on our politics. There were other leaders. Some would argue that Peter de Geer and Desmond Hoyt. But I think in terms of impact on shaping the direction of our politics from the 1950s to the present, I think those four, certainly Burnham and Jagan governed as our principal leaders. And so in that regard, in the circumstances of our post-colonial experience were much more from the pragmatic mold, although they were both ideologues. Both described themselves as Marxists of some sort, but because they governed, one cannot make an analysis of their contribution without taking into consideration that they actually sat in the seat of government as principal leaders. And the other two, of course, would come more from the radical tradition, more the larger Black Caribbean radical tradition, and more because they were not governors, had the luxury of being much more ideological in terms of their thrust. And so different kind of leaders, but would have made the same impact. Of course, in our divisive politics, all four of those leaders have their detractors and they have their admirers. But I think everyone can agree that they had what I would call a messianic relationship with their followers. At a certain level, their followers agreed that the legitimacy, gave them the legitimacy that they were leaders. And I think, sometimes I read something in the papers yesterday or today or something, and somebody was saying, Burnham was a dictator. And of course, I mean, if you talk to people who are non-PNC people, or you talk to people who are non-African, that would be their immediate response. I grew up in the African community, and I think the immediate response to Jagan is that he was a racist, although I detect a more nuanced assessment of Jagan in the African community. And I don't want anybody to get me wrong, because I'm not making a qualitative judgment here as to how the two communities deal with leaders across the board. But I find in the African community over the years a much more nuanced approach, an assessment of Jagan than the Indian community, and perhaps the ethnic narratives have taken more root in the Indian community than perhaps in the African community. I've always argued that Burnham has had to contend in its time with challenges for within the African community. He had to compete with Guyana, who was his contemporary later on. He had to confront the presence of Walter Rodney. Some people argue that Rolf Farley and Llewellyn John also posed challenges. And I think if you go on the PPP side, the Indian side, Dr. Jagan was almost unchallenged. There were moments when people came along, Balram Singh Rai in the early 1960s, and Moses Bagwan to some extent, and then you had Paul Tennessee and Rafi Def. But I don't think they presented the same kind of challenge to Dr. Jagan for legitimacy within the community, within the Indian community, as those in the African community presented for Burnham. I contend that political leadership in our Guyana cannot be seen outside of our politics. Cannot be seen outside of our politics. And I think in our assessment of political leaders, we have to be as nuanced as our situation has been since independence. Our experience in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in the post-independence era, has not been a straightforward experience. And you can't expect a kind of straightforward, dogmatic assessment of our leaders, because to say that is to say that our leaders did not come out of our problematic environment. And so those are things I think that we have to walk through. If you look at Burnham's contemporaries, whether it's Eric Williams in Trinidad, Errol Barrow in Barbados, Michael Manley, Verboord, Eric Gary, there has been a rethink, even by radicals who challenged them, about their role. In the 1970s, the radicals came along and said, look, you all are reformers. What we want is transformation of the society. Those radicals of the 70s are now old men and women. And I think there has been a more nuanced, I use that term again, a more nuanced assessment of the post-independence leaders. And that's where I want to locate Burnham. I want to locate Burnham within the context of the decolonization movement, which began in the post-World War II era, and the early independence. So you're talking about the first 2 decades of independence and the decade or so before independence. I think if we don't locate a Burnham there, or Eric Williams, or a Jagan there, we lose the essence of them. And their whole ideological trust is, I think, at Burnham lived longer. He would have given us some more food to go with. Guyana is 98, going to be 98 in a couple of months. He has had the luxury of living much longer. So you have much more to chew when you assess somebody like him, or even Jagan, who lived to be 79. He lived another 12 years after Burnham died. But a Burnham who died at 62, or a Rodney who died at 38, you have to make do with what you have. And it would have been interesting that Burnham lived longer, up to 1890, to really see what the analysis would have been. I'm sure it would have been somewhat different, expanded from what we have. But Burnham would be 100 today, and that's a lot of years. I mean, I try to always remark that in 1953, Burnham was 30 years old. Martin Carter was 25. Guyana was 28. Jagan was the oldest of them. Well, Dr. Lachman Singh was older than Jagan. But Jagan in 1953 was 35. Mrs. Jagan was 33. These were young men and women, you know, in terms of age. And you go across the English-speaking Caribbean and you would see them at that age. And they're taking on the might of empire and trying to bring independence. And I think one has to look at them within that context. Burnham took power in 1964. You know, he was a mere 41 years old. I mean, that's relatively young by some of the standards that we see now. And one has to take into consideration that youthfulness when one is making assessment. What were the challenges of independence? I think that is extremely important. What were the challenges of independence? Remember, Guyana and the English-speaking Caribbean are becoming independent in the 60s in a world that wasn't created for them. The Bretton Woods Agreement at the end of the Second War was about European powers and the North American powers. It was not about Guyana and Trinidad and they didn't exist. They didn't exist. And so we are becoming independent in this world that wasn't created for us. With the onerous, the big challenge of literally turning abandoned plantations into nations, because that's what Guyana and St. Kitts and Nevis and Jamaica, they were plantations that were abandoned by the British. And our leaders were tasked with turning plantations into nations. I am making these introductory remarks in a sense to frame the discussion, because I often, all of us do it, and I'm sure we're going to hear some of that tonight. You know, people are going to laud their leaders who they admire. It's the human thing to do. And they're going to talk about their greatness and so on and so forth. But I hope by the end of the conversation, we would get a peek into the problematic of our own existence and how those leaders were both products of the problematic, but also tried to deal with the problematic and where we are now. So welcome to Politics 101. Burnham at 100 years he would have been today had he lived. It's a busy week for us. We are tracking the Woodley Park story. We're tracking that story. 53 years of republicanism. What does it mean? What does it mean? We are tracking that and some of the other stories that have made the news this week. So it's a big week. We kick the week off with Burnham at 100. Please share the link. Please share the link. And please let everyone know Politics 101 is on. If you're joining us from Guyana, welcome. It's your week. It's our week. You know, it's the week of Burnham. It's the week of the 1763 revolution. It's the week of Mashramani. This is a week that is pregnant with history. And often in societies such as ours, we do not do enough justice in terms of elevating our history and what that history has produced to the pinnacle of the world. You know, when you think about our village movement, which has not been replicated in no other part of the African diaspora, it's unique to Guyana. Or you think about the 1763 revolution, in that age of revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution. Our academics say the 1763 was a rebellion. They held the Berbice for almost 2 months. And in our circumstances, coming up against the might of the plantocracy and slavery, it was a revolution. There would be no 1838 without 1763, and there would be no 1966 without 1763. And I hear our historians, you know, one of the things I learned about learned from Walter Rodney, he said, academics must be intentional and it must be political. What are you studying this thing to say about yourself? When he wrote Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and he sent it to his former advisor, the advisor told him this was a political pamphlet. Today, Europe Underdeveloped Africa is a classic. But Rodney was very clear about what he wanted to do with that text. He wanted to change the way we looked at African and Black historiography. And sometimes our contemporary scholars try to be objective. There was nothing objective about slavery and colonialism and the post-colonial experience. Nothing objective about that, right? You're telling me colonialism was objective? Slavery was objective? Then why are sons and daughters of the colonized and the indentured are talking about objectivity? Objectivity, but your own objectivity, our Guyanese and Caribbean objectivity. And from what I have heard about Burnham, at least he had the audacity to understand that, and to understand that power has to be intentionally used to erase the sense of inferiority that is one that has been one of the legacies of our sordid history. So here tonight, we're going to be talking about Burnham. We're going to be talking about Burnham. And my guests are Vincent Alexander, the chairman of the Burnham Foundation, the one person, among others, who has been keeping the Burnham torch lighted. He's been keeping it alight because we live in this world that is moving so quickly that we forget our own family. You know, much more our leaders who lived 3-4 decades ago, died 3-4 decades ago. Our own Dave Martins and the Trade Winds, as that song, Where Are Your Heroes, Caribbean? And Vincent has been keeping that alive. We have a young man, Kibwe Copeland, who is the chairman of the GYSM, and we have Aubrey Norton, the current leader of the PNC, who is double dipping here tonight because he's up in Linden, where they have a symposium, but he's going to join us from Linden. He's already backstage. And Vanessa Kisoon, also up there at Linden, she's expected to join us. So let's go. Let's begin our program tonight. Let me bring on Vincent Alexander. Good evening, Vincent.
Good evening. Good evening to you and viewers.
Good evening, Kibwe.
Yes, good.
And let me just ask you all for your opening remarks on Burnham within the context of my introduction. And I know my introduction was by no means straightforward or narrow. I mean, I scrambled for all things. But if someone is 18 years old, and I'm deliberately asking this question, if a young man, a young woman is 18 years old, which means they were born in 2005, and you were to talk to them about Burnham, what would you say? And then, let me go the other way. If someone is 70 odd years old today 80 odd years old today, 60 odd years old today, and you were talk to them about them, would you have the same messages or the same focus, or would they be different different messages? And if so, what would be those messages? I'll start with you, Vincent.
Thank you very much. If I were to, well, not if I were to, when I speak with younger people about Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, my tendency is to focus on the contribution he made to nation building. And I want to emphasize the term nation building, because I don't see Burnham's contribution as just projects. I see Burnham's contribution as pulling together a number of institutions to give life to a nation as one. To give life to a nation as one. And therefore, in that regard, doing what would have been done in other places prior to our own experience, and that is to attempt to build a nation. And nation building in that regard speaks to how do you create institutions that are reflective of the interrelationships among the various people, be it class or ethnicity in a society. In the case of Guyana, a peculiarity which had to be observed is the fact that we were a plural society with various ethnic groups that had an experience that divided them rather than brought them together, at least immediately before we gained independence. So Burnham was someone who was challenged to work in a manner to bring the people of Guyana together around institutions. And in fact, to try to build a nation which can only be built if you create institutions that speak to the reality of the people who live in that country in a manner as to bring them together in one way or the other. Let me hasten to explain that by using an example. One of the early institutions that Burnham created was the Bank of Guyana, Bank of Guyana. And here he created an institution that was intended to deal with our monetary system, a system which is at the bedrock of the interrelationship between the people. If you don't have a monetary system, and you don't have the basis for people to be able to exchange goods and services, as well as the basis for the country as a whole to relate to other countries in the exchange of goods and services. So you see what I mean by institution, a body that is relevant to a realization of a certain level of interrelationship and stability and growth. And that to a large extent is what Burnham was about in Guyana. Now, if I speak to the young people, I would say to them, well, here are things that Burnham did that people today tend not to want to speak about. And if I were to speak to the older people, I would say, do you realize in retrospect what he was doing? Do you realize in retrospect what he was doing? And when you speak about retrospect, for example, one of the best examples is the National Insurance Scheme, which was another institution that allowed for Guyanese, irrespective of religion, sex, race, whatever, to have some security, economic security, after they would have retired. And when that was being created, There are persons who saw it at a very individualistic level. This man taking money out my salary. He's not allowing me to spend all of my own salary. And therefore, he's interfering with me. But the fact of the matter is that NIS turned out to be an institution that was responsive to the state of our senior citizens beyond their retirement. And so it's responsive to all of them. The other thing about the institutions is that they really are intergenerational. When they're built, they are not built for one generation and then disappear with that generation. They are built to serve the nation through a growth process and are themselves a reflection of the dynamics of the society. So the institution doesn't go away, but it responds and grows in response to the effort to harmonize the society into one whole, notwithstanding the continuous diversity in society. So to the young people, I'd say there are things you're looking at today and that you take for granted that were constructed out of the thoughts, out of the wisdom, out of the foresight of the Indian Forbes Burnham. And to the old people, I'll say, what do you think in retrospect? Do you still think that he was not serving a good purpose when he did what you thought was hurtful to you?
Vincent Alexander, chairman of the Burnham Foundation. Brother Aubrey Norton, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Hi, good evening. I forgot that you said you were going to join us by phone. I was looking for the video. So you heard my question. I'll come to you now. And I'll put the same question to you. If you were talking to younger people, as I'm sure you're doing now as you go around the country doing party work, what would you say to them about Burnham? And if you were to talk to people of your age group and older, how would you locate Burnham?
Well, first of all, I will endorse everything that Vincent said. I mean, Vincent and I spoke about this, and this morning I did a presentation in which I said Burnham was the national institution builder. As it relates to young people, I had a practical experience this morning. I asked them questions. I said, do you know that Guyana used to import saltfish? And none of them knew. And I said to them, Burnham told us that why do we have to bring saltfish from Europe and North America when all you need is fish, sun to dry it, and somebody to pick it up if the rain comes. And I pointed out to them that Burnham banned foreign saltfish and trained and encouraged the production of local saltfish, so that today they don't know that saltfish was imported. And the fact that there is an industry called the saltfish industry and we're exporting to the Caribbean is part of the vision of Forbes Burnham. I would have pointed out that he was criticized for it. I asked them, do you know that we imported vegetables in the 50s and 60s, and that Forbes Burnham developed a food program that resulted in us producing all the vegetables we need that could have been produced in this part of the world? Many of them didn't know. And then I asked them, I said, do you know that if you traveled from the Quarantine to New Amsterdam, Rosignol to Georgetown, Georgetown to Timeri, you used to be covered in red dust because there was no paved roads, and that the infrastructure, the Suzdijk-Linden Highway, and a lot of what we call the modern infrastructure, they were put in place by Forbes Burnham. And so I would tend to direct the young people to the actual things that Burnham did. Many of them didn't know that it was Burnham who put the regional system in place and promoted local democracy. Now, when it comes to the older people, I take a slightly different approach. My approach, well, let me put it differently. A lot of the older people now meet me to say they now understand what Burnham was doing. Many of them would say Burnham was a man ahead of his time. When I was talking to the young people about holidays, I pointed out to them that only holidays, Christian activities were celebrated as holidays: Easter, Good Friday, Christmas, etc. And I pointed out to them that Forbes Burnham was the person who made holidays of the other religion. Now, a lot of the people, the older people, will now point that out to me as a good. So, what I tend to do with the older persons is to get from them what elements of their views would have changed from when Burnham was in action to now Burnham in retrospect. And that is how I would generally engage as it relates to Burnham and the two generations. But for me, Burnham was an institution builder. Burnham had clear policies. Today, I pointed out that it is as a result of Burnham action that the hinterland is accessible. And if you now know that you can virtually go to regions 7, 8, and 9 through Linden based on the infrastructure, even though not paved, created or built by Burnham. So I would tend to deal with it in a practical way. But when I meet academics, it's a different kind of approach altogether, because I will then put it in the context of the Cold War, the context of all these young radicals emerging, and everybody believing that they could challenge and take on the imperialist system in the quickest of time. And in that regard, I will say to them, Burnham was the most pragmatic. Not that you disagreed with the philosophy that underpinned many of them that spoke, but many of them, in my opinion, underestimated the power of the West, underestimated the power of North America and Europe. And may I also admit that Burnham himself underestimated it. And it is only around 1984 that he said to the diplomatic corps, let us re-engage the West and set a new basis for engagement, because he recognized in that Cold War era, even though the socialist world was there, they didn't have the capacity to take on Europe and North America, much less you, a small developing country. So even in my youth, I think I was a young radical. But with hindsight, a lot of the radicalism did not serve us well. It served us in the sense that it keep the others from not becoming too conservative. But it didn't serve us good when it comes to actually achieving things, taking into consideration the context in which it was being done. And that will be my approach to it.
Thank you very much, Aubrey Norton, leader of the People's National Congress. And thanks for going to the P word, pragmatism, before you came on. I did describe Mr. Burnham and Dr. Jagan, who were ideologues, but I think the fact that they governed at a critical and complex time, they had to be pragmatic. And thanks for opening that up for us. Young Copeland, Kibwe, welcome Kibwe, and sorry to keep you waiting. But as a young man, what Burnham means to you, what Forbes Burnham means to you as a young man, and if you could take the liberty of speaking for your generation, what does Burnham mean to you and your generation?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I believe a great leader, and that's a question I would pose to both young people and even to older persons. That question or that statement of a great leader raises the eyebrows of anyone. Persons would ask why and who. Why Forbes Burnham? Forbes Burnham, of course, would have, what should I say, started most of what we know today. Of course, times would have changed, things might have changed, but Forbes Burnham would have set the pillars, the foundations for what we would have enjoyed today, and some that we haven't been able to enjoy as well. When I talk to young people, I always talk about, we hear about this free education from nursery to university. And for your persons who are born after the death of Burnham do not know about that privilege of being going to university without a tuition fee. To know that leader, Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, who would have created the avenue, even in a time whereby we didn't have oil, we didn't have all these resources at this point in time. But at that time, he could have created the avenue for young people to get free education from nursery to university. And when we think about independence itself, 1966, making Guyana an independent country. When you think about, I know I've heard stories about the national park. Persons have the privilege now to go to the national park and to play cricket and to walk and to exercise. The national park under colonial rule was not a place that the normal Guyanese could have gone and commemorate or, normally dwell. Under Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham as the Prime Minister, making Guyana an independent country, we're given that privilege to enjoy the national park. We're given the privilege to become judges, to become lawyers, to become police officers and head of armed forces. These are things that we were not permitted to be or to enjoy under colonial rule. And a young man, as you spoke, David Hines, about when Burnham, when Chedi, when these young activists at the ages of 30, 35, when they would have started off into politics, going against colonial powers to gain independence, then later, of course, gaining the cooperative status, making Ghana the first cooperative republic in Americas. That, of course, is remarkable and something young people should take note of. When I read some of the text that speaks about Burnham's life, in 1942 when he won a scholarship, it speaks to his intellectual capacity, a scholarship that only one Guyanese could have gotten. One Guyanese, and Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham was the person who was selected for that scholarship, which speaks to his intellectual capacity. And of course, when you look at his time as the president for the West Indies student movement in 1947, when he led a delegation to the World Youth Festival in Czechoslovakia, speaks to a young man at the time who...
I think we've lost Kibwe's audio. I think we've lost Kibwe's audio. While he is getting that sorted out, let me say good evening to my friend Jasper Oliver Adams. Jasper Adams, of course, is known in the theater arena, and I think he acted in a play that they did. He and Kwesi Ojingo and that crowd did a play on Burnham. I remember in the 1980s. Good evening, Jasper, and good evening to all of you who are joining us on Politics 101 tonight. Yes, today Burnham would have been 100 years, and we are, in a sense, looking back at his life and his significance to our Guyana. Aubrey and Vincent, let me pose this question to you all, because you both of you would have talked about the policies that Burnham championed and enacted. But as I look across the Caribbean and Africa and Asia, one would have seen similar projects by leaders, whether it's in Nkrumah in Ghana, Nyerere in Tanzania, or Barrow in Barbados, Michael Manley in Jamaica. So in that sense, a lot of the programs were not unique to Burnham. But I want you all to really tell us what uniqueness Burnham brought to the enactment of those policies. I'll start with you, Vincent.
All right, I agree to you. I agree with you that those programs were not necessarily unique, and I would make the point that the exposure of Burnham and Barrow and Manley to the metropole gave them an opportunity to understand what nation building was, because those countries had gone through and experienced that, and so they were able to see both the positive elements of those countries in terms of how they became strong nations, and the negative elements of those countries in terms of how they related to others in that process of becoming a strong nations. So that whether it's Nyerere or Nkrumah or Burnham or Manley, these guys had a world exposure that allowed them to have a world outlook. They weren't merely caught up in things local. They were expansive in what they had seen and experienced, and brought that to bear in their own little corners of the world. But in so doing, Burnham was in many regards responsive to the realities of the country that he had to deal with. And the issues which confronted him would have been, for example, the question of how do you bring together various ethnic groups who have different origins, and among whom antagonism in some regard was inculcated as the basis of interrelationships, as the Europeans sought to divide and to rule. So the challenge there in Guyana, for example, was how do you overcome the problem of antagonistic relationships among the various groups. You know, there are people who will argue we were peaceful people, we didn't have problems before the 60s and all of that. But I would contend that the potential for those problems always existed based on the fact that we were from different parts of the world with different cultures. And more than that, that we were pitted one against the other by the colonizers as their mechanism for creating an environment where which they could exploit, and where they could dominate. So that the challenge that Burnham would have been faced with is how do I overcome this division that existed? And so one would see in a Guyana situation, as opposed to probably Barbados, which was a more homogeneous society, probably Jamaica, which was more stratum divided than ethnic divided. How do I bring these people together for the purpose of nation building? And so you would see institutions, and again I go back to institutions, like national service, for example, which was not something that was created in Barbados or created in Jamaica or anywhere else. An institution that sought to create an ethos, a Guyanese ethos, and a Guyanese exposure that would then, in some regards, create the Guyana man. A Guyana man who would, on one hand, be of a particular ethnic background, but on the other hand, being able to come together based on the commonalities of being in one space and being dependent upon each other for the development of the system, which would then lend to the individual development. So that is a kind of challenge I think that Burnham was faced with in his attempt to give leadership to Guyana. And that would have been manifest in, I gave the example of dealing with something like a national service. It would also been manifest in the political system that he sought to put in place. You know, lots of people don't know that in the West Indies, that local government was given far more attention than in other parts of the West Indies. It was the first country where, in fact, local government was enshrined in the constitution. And in some regards, local government was a response to the diversity of the nation, where you attempted, whilst you were building one nation, to allow people in their own little cocoons to feel that they belonged and that they were in charge and they were controlling, not to the detriment of working together for nation building. So that was another area, the political system in some regards, the political system. And so we saw that in the 70s and in the 80s before he died, that Burnham was also working for national unity, recognizing that we had a plural society and that there was a problem of apparent ethnic dominance, both at the time and possibly beyond the time, based on which party was in power, and therefore the need to find a way to create a political system that would deal with this question of ethnic domination. So we saw in the 70s, we saw him working with Shedi to try to bring that about. And we saw him again in the 80s working with Shedi to try to bring that about, a recognition. You know, I always recall, and Aubrey quoted it this morning, that in the 70s, when we were going to a festival in Cuba, and I led the YSM. The YSM was largely an organization of people of African descent. And we picked our team to go to Cuba. Burnham said to us in no uncertain terms that once you were leaving these borders, then you were leaving to represent Guyana, not to represent a particular party, and by virtue of that, a particular ethnic group. And he gave us directives to ensure that we pull together a representative body of Guyanese youths to go overseas. So he really recognized the need to get the Guyanese to work together and to be reflective of the diverse reality of the Guyana that we lived in.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vincent Alexander, Chairman of the Burnham Foundation. Aubrey, same question to you. The universality of the policies that Burnham enacted, and but what is the particularity of Burnham as he tried to, well, not tried to, as he implemented those policies?
If one accepts that the larger part of Guyana was hinterland, and in the pre-Burnham era, there was little or no focus on the hinterland. And then around 1967, 1968, Burnham developed a policy called hinterland development. in which he established the institutions to allow us to open the hinterland. In this case, the Upper Majoroni Development Authority was created, and the Upper Mazaruni Road Project, UMRP. Though people were critical of them, what in fact they did was establish a vital link between the coast and the hinterland, especially our indigenous people. And so at a time when people felt Burnham was wasting money, Burnham was opening Guyana. Now, let us be cognizant of the fact that Burnham didn't just see hinterland development as merely opening the hinterland. Let us recall that Burnham was one of the first to recognize that Guyana was a low-lying coastal state, and he actually spoke about shifting the capital to highlands. In this case, I think he had identified Matthews Ridge. Here was a man, before all the talks about climate change, recognizing that while most of us live on the coast, the beauty and the wealth of Guyana was in the hinterland. And he almost immediately, in a very structured way, began to open the lands in the hinterland. And at the same time, as he engaged the indigenous peoples, he began the process of giving them titles to their land. I do not believe that there was a similar case in many of the other countries. And so when it comes to the specificity of his contribution, I believe his actions, his policies, and his programs in terms of hinterland development was a particular and peculiar one. Also, many of the Caribbean countries and the African countries, I think, still continued the approach of importing a lot from the developed world. Burnham, at great risk, said to the Guyanese people, we cannot let our foreign exchange go to those who already have. When we have the land to produce the things we want to produce, he later told the Caribbean, we either produce or we will perish. And I believe Burnham's people might disagree and say he should not have banned. But the positive impact of, first of all, removing the psychological slavery from our people's mind by encouraging them to do what he called buy local. A lot of people miss the significance of that because at the time, virtually everything you had was foreign. And here was a man taking the risk of saying to you, look, we have the land, we have the human resource. We need to begin this process of emancipating ourselves from mental slavery vis-a-vis food from North America and Europe, and begin to see the value in us utilizing our resources. I recall when Forbes Burnham was advocating the use of coconut oil, there were many who condemned it. Now you're in a world in which the very people who are telling you not to focus on that, it is high in cholesterol, etc. Now that when they have the capacity to produce it and access it in other parts of the world, you're hearing the glory of coconut oil, more so virgin coconut oil. And I believe in that regard, Burnham was unique because many in the Caribbean, many in Africa did not want to challenge the status quo as it relates to food and food security. And Burnham did that. The other area I think Burnham stood out is advocacy of cooperativism.
We seem to have
There was
lost
a land
Erica.
distribution problem in Guyana, and he sought ways and means of rectifying the imbalance in the allocation of lands. And in that regard, he promoted the cooperative movement as a mechanism to get the small man to own lands. Of course, we know there was the disadvantage of it being collective in an individualistic world. But the mere fact that Burnham was willing and prepared to try a new mode of land allocation to people, in my opinion, points again to the specificities of his policies as distinct from the generic policies promoted in the Caribbean and Africa. And so I am of the view that Burnham studied Guyana and sought solutions to the problems of Guyana. And therefore, in that regard, he was visionary. Mind you, there were mistakes made. There were problems as it relates to the cooperative movement. But no one can gainsay the fact that in terms of a mechanism to ensure he who does not have land get land, I think Forbes Burnham's policies stood out and should still be reinvestigated to find new ways and means of achieving the same objective using the same mechanisms, but with probably different approaches. And so I think the land question is a critical question that Burnham addressed at the time. While while people will not put his approach to education in that context, I will. Here was a man who, at a time when we lacked the resources, we didn't have the resources, he felt one of the ways of breaking down the barriers between the haves and the have nots was to create an education system that allowed our people to get education once they had the capacity to do so. And I remember years ago, a journalist, I think it was, who was questioning him and saying, how can a little poor country like Guyana afford free education from nursery to university? And his response was, you prefer to try the option of high levels of ignorance? And so he made an investment at a time when it was taboo for a small state without resources to make that critical decision and afforded a large percentage of the Guyanese society the opportunity to get that education. Mind you, it was done in a way that all Guyanese benefited. Of course, there were issues when he said everybody had to do national service to give back. But that apart, I think Burnham's approach to education was unique. One last area I want to add, his attempts at developing hydro. The United States, the developed world, opposed him on this issue. But Burnham had seen very, very early the danger of dependence on fossil fuels and sought to move in the direction of, of hydro. Sometimes people forget that Burnham went down the road of linking farms to develop biogas as an alternative. Sometimes people forget that Burnham had experiments done on dryers, local dryers driven by the sun to dry fruits. And so, in that regard, I think he was unique. That will be my contribution in this matter.
Aubrey Norton, leader of the People's National Congress and an unabashed admirer of Forbes Burnham. Although I said on this program a couple of weeks ago when Aubrey and I crossed paths when we were at UG, and then about 15, 20 years later, we crossed paths again at the same time that I get to know Vincent Alexander. That one of the things that I was struck by these two brothers was the capacity to look at Burnham in a critical way, even as they continue to admire him in a profuse way. Brother Kibwe, let me bring you back in. Your generation, would not know Burnham in the same way. I was surprised that when I would go into communities and I would mention Burnham, it was just another name. And you are in charge of the youth arm of the PNC. What do you think that we need to do to get someone like Burnham to get into the consciousness of young people again?
Well, I believe the People's National Congress reform is a legacy of Forbes Burnham, and the policies that the party would have continuously pushed for this nation is also a legacy of Burnham. So when we speak about what the PNCR is all about, what we are for, what the things that we advocate for, it comes from the pillars that Forbes Burnham would have set from his time. We would have just, of course, modernized it to basically relay the message in this new time, the 21st century. But it's all a foundation that was laid by Burnham, which, of course, even in this new time, still is much relevant. I believe as a youth leader, it is a responsibility of myself and other youth leaders to understand where Burnham, what was the ideas of Burnham, of course, what was his deeper thought. I know when I think about him, I heard so much stories before even becoming a politician, before even reading books about Burnham. You'd hear the positive parts, of course, of a national leader, someone who was about nation building, someone who brought us to independence, somebody who brought Guyana to a corporate state, etc. And then you also heard the lineups and this and the other negatives, which I would not mention because I don't like to promote the negatives. What I would say is that Burnham was a leader who was a leader in a very, what should I say, strange time or difficult time. You will just come out of enslavement, just come out of colonial rule, and you have to lead people who might not have had that knowledge or exposure that he was blessed to have. So you had persons, and I think I heard this particular quote from someone. I believe the quote that Burnham would have said that if you can take a man out of the colony, but you can't take the colony out of a man. And we had the majority of Guyanese who were still in that state of being a part of a colony, being subjective to colonial powers. So to go on your independent self and to do things, to operate independently was a bit strange. Coming out of enslavement, which of course is another psychological demoralization, then into colonial rule, imperialism, and then back into an independent state. It was how do we actually move forward? Is it a good or is it a bad? And people were fearful of that. Burnham, of course, saw the positives in this. He saw how we can become self-sufficient and how in the long run we be more of a force to reckon with as a country. And he would have made the steps and of course the decisions he would have made And I commend his leadership. I commend what he would have left us, what we would have inherited because of his leadership. And as a young politician, I believe I have a duty to continue what he would have started, and of course to evolve it. You know, it's not about staying in the same path. It's not about trying to regurgitate the same things that Burnham would have done, but to understand his ideologies and where it was leading us as a people, as a nation. And, you know, as I said, I didn't meet Burnham. Burnham died before I was born. But for the little that I do know, and of course, the leaders who I had the privilege to work along with, like Vincent Alexander, who is the head of the chairman of the Burnham Foundation, Aubrey Norton, who is the leader of the PNCR, people who came, or would say products of Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham. Their intellect, their abilities, their zeal and advocacy coming from that era really impresses me. When I sit down with these great men and listen to them and listen to their conversations, listen to the things that they've done, and of course the impacts they would have made, not only in the life of others, but even in my life. You know, it begs me to say, you know what, Burnham really did a good job. He did a good job, so good that the persons who would have he would have molded are now molding me as a young man in the 21st century. So for me, I believe it is Burnham is unquestionable. They can say whatever they want to say. In my eyes, Burnham was a great leader. I don't think we've ever seen a leader like Burnham until this day. Yes, we have great leaders, but Burnham is one of a kind. They say they come only in 100 years. In 100 years, maybe I have another Burnham who was born today. But when I listen to his speeches, I remember listening to the press conferences and listening to his decorum, his way of speech. He can be intellectual in this moment, then he can come straight down to the ground level and be as radical and down to earth as possible within a slip of a finger. He was skillful in his approach to people. He was a people's person. I believe out of everything else, his life's vision, I think I agree with, I think a text that was written by James, I remember the name, but his main focus was the people. How can you better the lives of people? Everything that you do within this country as a leader, whether it be infrastructure, whether it be education, whether it be security, it all boils down to how will it benefit the man, how will it benefit the woman, how will it benefit the child, how will it benefit the citizens of this country. And I believe he dedicated his life, his leadership, his abilities towards making a better life for the small man, and of course, making it better for those who wouldn't call or consider themselves as a small man. And that I think is one of the most commendable things that the Forbes Sampson Burnham is known for. And I believe one of the things that the People's National Congress reform, through all of its arms, the GYSM, the NCW, and of course the general leadership, continue to push, fighting and battling for the small man, despite all the odds.
Kibwe Copeland, chairman of the GYSM, we the old timers would remember that organization as the YSM. I've always felt, you know, once you are on the G, it took that kind of sheen. But young people have to embrace the present, and you know, we now have PNCR and PPPC and so on. I don't use those. For me, it's still the PNC and the PPP and the YSM. But thank you, young man, for your insights. Vincent and Aubrey, I have to take you all to what I consider, if I were to assess Burnham coming from my ideological standpoint, and that is on the question of foreign policy. I think even Burnham's detractors have to admit that his foreign policy was progressive by any measure in any era, whether it's the present era or back then. So I'm asking you all the question in two parts. What ideological a thrust push Burnham in the direction of that kind of foreign policy that he embraced at a time during the Cold War, when to take a non-aligned position, a strong regional integration position, an anti-apartheid / African liberation position. When you bring those three aspects of his foreign policy together. I think it's unparalleled, even among his peers. Vincent, you go first.
The first point I would make about that, which is the classical point, is that your foreign policy is normally a reflection of your
Your
national policy.
domestic policy.
And so when one speaks about Burnham's foreign policy, it's a reflection also of his national policy. And it's a reflection of a point Aubrey was making about the importance that he attributed to education. So that one aspect of his foreign policy was the way in which he sought to have the best minds engaged in his foreign policy. He saw education, he saw intellect as the tool that was available to the developed world and a developing country, the major tool. We did not have all of the material resources, but we had the intellect that could do two things, that could gain us recognition, and forgive me for saying, but that was the strength of Walter Rodney as well. Intellect that gained him recognition. And Burnham saw that intellect could gain us recognition. So that if we were to put out there some of our best brains, then that would give us recognition. And if we got that recognition, it would give us the scope to be influential. Influential. And against the background of his approach, his national approach, that whole idea of cooperativism, then we could be influential in the international arena of having people work together, But not just having people work together, but having people who had like interests working together. Now remember that Burnham studied in Europe, recognized the dichotomy between the developed world and the developing world, and therefore would have recognized the need for those in the developing world to work together. He understood the Cold War, the efforts at domination by the East and by the West, notwithstanding the relationship he was able to develop with the East eventually. And therefore, he recognized that there was, for us to be successful, we couldn't do it alone. We had to be working with others, and that there was a lot of strength in unity. He recognized that he had to be responsive to our territorial dispute, and that we didn't have the gunpowder and the physical manpower to deal with that. And again, he recognized that we had to use intellectual power to deal with that. And so his diplomacy sought to create that body of people. And it is intricate because a recognition that, look, you can't do this alone. You can't, no matter how intellectual you are, you can't go there alone and fight a struggle like the struggle we had to fight to deal with our border matter. You needed the support of others. You needed the kind of manpower derived from unity that will help you in that struggle. And so that informed his approach. And in trying to build his own nation, he recognized that other nations that were faced with similar problems needed similar approach. So whether it was Zimbabwe or whether it was South Africa or whether it was Namibia, he understood the need for them to be able to work with others in the pursuit of their liberation. In Guyana, he pursued the question of independence, self-reliance, self-sufficiency, and one could see that itself projected into his foreign policy, where he talked about a new economic order, because he recognized that there is a global ecology, and no matter what you did locally, you were a cog in that global ecology. And if you didn't bring to bear what you were doing on the global ecology, then you would fail locally. And so, from an economic perspective, he also sought to impact and influence the world order. And again, we saw him working with people like Nyerere, and I think Nyerere, Castro, and himself were three of the leaders who really pushed this question of a new economic order. And that was not just foreign policy, it was a projection of local, national policy. So he had a very holistic and systemic approach to the growth and development of Guyana, recognizing that we were just but one cog in a wheel, and that if we were going to change, bring about change, that change had to be not only about us, it had to be change about the environment in which we were existing. So he really saw foreign policy as an extension of his national policy. He brought the same ethos of cooperation to his foreign policy. He recognized the role of the intellect in all of this, and so he emphasized the intellect in his foreign policy and was not parochial in terms of just promoting party people for jobs. He recognized that you had to have the best brains out there to be able to get the kind of recognition required that would then allow you to be able to influence the institutions and the movement that were international, all of which would be down to the local benefit, because it would create the environment in which what he was doing locally would strive.
Vincent Alexander, chairman of the Burnham Foundation. Aubrey Norton, you worked in the public service. You lectured at the University of Guyana in international relations. So you have an intimate relationship with this subject. Continuing from where Vincent left off, locate Burnham's foreign policy within the context of his broader praxis.
Well, I didn't hear the total question and most of Vincent because I was knocked off. But
Okay.
I sense I have an idea as to where it was going. Look, when one is looking at Ghana's foreign policy, one has to understand Ghana geographically. First, we are a low-lying coastal state. Second, we are surrounded by Suriname, Venezuela, and Brazil. We have to recognize that Guyana's territory has been under threat just before independence and up until now. And so, one of the cardinal variables that determine Guyana's foreign policy is the fact that we are a small state without an army that could really battle with the likes of Venezuela. And so we had to resort to diplomacy as our first line of defense. And in that context, Burnham recognized that he needed the brightest and the best. And so he assembled a team that developed the foreign policy infrastructure that brought us this far without military aggression. Let us recall that Burnham went out of his way to get back Sir Sridhar Ramphal. We had the likes of Rashley Jackson. And so he developed a core that was nationalistic, but at the same time intellectually sound and pragmatic. Burnham practiced what was called concentricism in foreign policy. He believed that first, this inner circle, Guyana, Venezuela, Brazil, Suriname, must be in good relations. And so that was his first circle. He then proceeded to advocate as well for regional integration, which brought the second circle into focus, and the promotion of Latin America, North and South America, and Europe. So, what in essence he did was to consolidate our frontiers. We have always had a frontiers division in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs because Burnham saw that as critical. But even as we did that, we mobilized wider afield. If you went to the foundation, to the exhibition today, you will see the quantity of books that were written on the Guyana-Venezuela territorial controversy. Burnham also recognized that fundamental to us achieving our objective was the education of the population. And in those days, and regrettably it doesn't continue, virtually every child knew the issue. And so you had the link at home in terms of knowledge, and then the activism in the wider world. Burnham also recognized that he had to be in solidarity with Africa. He had to be in solidarity with the struggling people of Latin America. But he was also very, very careful to ensure that our national interest came first, way ahead of ideological considerations. I do recall when Russia, then Soviet Union, invaded Afghanistan, there were those who were saying Burnham was an ideological prostitute because he was socialist and did not support a socialist country invading another country. And Burnham made it clear that as a small state, we cannot condone aggression at any level. And that became a cardinal principle in our foreign policy. We became opposed to any form of invasion or aggression. Let us not forget, in 1968, when the PPP was trying to mobilize support for the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, Burnham was clear in his head, we will not condone military or any form of aggression against any state. And it put us in trouble when the United States invaded Grenada in 1983. Again, Burnham stood up against the powers that be and suffered from it at the political level. But the consistency of the policy served us in good stead, so that even today, when the Ukraine was invaded by Russia, we had no difficulty saying no to that aggression, because a cardinal element of our foreign policy that has been developed over the years is we say no to aggression in any fashion. And Burnham worked to build the solidarity in the third world. His adoption of the policy of non-alignment is another indication of where he stood. Remember, this was a Cold War context, and people were either lining up east or west. Burnham said it is our national interests that should determine. And our national interests dictated that we be non-aligned, meaning when it comes to issues in international affairs, no one will determine our decision. It will be made based on our national interests. And in that regard, non-alignment served us good. And when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War was no more in the general sense, Guyana had to adapt to the change in circumstance. We maintain our position of no to aggression. We maintain our position of solidarity with countries pursuing independence, solidarity with poor countries in Latin America, Caribbean, Africa. But then the world had changed and neoliberalism was taking over. Guyana now had to, in the new context, develop foreign policy positions that allow us to exist in this complicated world. And I always remember being involved in some of the discussions. And one of the things that happened then was you no longer had the two superpowers, you had a multipolarity of powers. And Guyana now had to develop a foreign policy position that allowed us to pursue our interests while relating to all the forces. And so our foreign policy became responsive to the concerns of the powers that be, but at the same time continuing to pursue our national interests and not jeopardizing it in the new emerging power configuration that is in the world. And even now, one has to be very careful with our foreign policy formulation and be informed by these cardinal principles. You now have a situation where right wing conservatism is challenging neoliberalism, and you had the Trump era, you have the Bolsonaros in Brazil, Modi in India, and a number of these new contestations have emerged. And we can utilize those same principles to establish that we will pursue our national interests and not be carried away by any of the extremes. And so I would say, for those of us who managed to engage and understood Burnham and his foreign policy approach, some fundamental principles have been laid down. Now, there are those who will argue that Burnham was political, diplomatically opportunistic. I don't agree. In fact, one time, Prem wrote that when he said that it took Burnham years to recognize Cuba. And in responding, I pointed out to Prem that when Burnham was opposing Cuba, the PPP here was linked to the what was then called the left-wing revolutionary movement in Venezuela, and it could not have been in Guyana's interest for that to happen. But then the Soviet Union gave up this approach of what they call export of revolution and decided that it will work with states rather than political parties as the front runner in foreign policy. And when that occurred, the context changed, and Burnham was able to embrace Cuba and lead the way in 1972 of us recognizing Cuba. And I have a written piece somewhere on that in which I analyze the geopolitical context and pointed out the pragmatism of Burnham even amidst the ideological contestations of the time. And so I do believe that if we study his foreign policy, we can deduct from it a lot of cardinal principles that we can use moving forward.
Thank you very much, Aubrey Norton. And brothers, as you notice, once you begin to talk about people like Burnham and so on, the time runs out so quickly. We can't really do as much justice as we would like to do. But I think we covered the main planks of Burnham's praxis and put him in context of our Guyana and our Caribbean. Kibri Copeland, your closing thoughts, and then I go to Vincent, and then Aubrey will close us off.
I was just, yes, I had a friend was messaging me, telling me that she was watching the program and so forth, and I asked her what did she got, at least from what I was saying. And her words was, what I got from what you were saying is that Burnham influenced a generation that has never met him, wasn't born in his time, but are enjoying the quality of life we are enjoying today. And it's good that, of course, that came from a young person who was looking at the program. Burnham, of course, would have influenced our lives today. We never met him. But until today, we hear him. Till today, we glorify his name. Until today, we are benefiting from some of the policies, the infrastructure, and even the people that he would have impacted their lives. And I believe with this year of 100 birth centennial anniversary, started today, of course, launched today, and will be ending until next year, February the 20th. I believe that we should try as much as possible to continue to portray the great vision of Forbes Burnham. I know there will be a lot of activities. Only today we had the opening ceremony at the NCW headquarters. Also, I think happening right now. I don't know if it's finishing or it's still in the mood. In Linden, there's a symposium happening there. I know the exhibition at the NCW continues tomorrow, and there'll be other activities. The debating competitions. There'll be spoken word. There are other things in the pipeline, of course, that'll be coming up that will continue to portray the vision of Forbes Burnham, of course, his legacy, what he would have done for this country, and what continues to lives on because of his contribution. So my final words is basically that as a young man, I think I have a responsibility, and along with other young leaders, we'll continue to push for a better country. That whole notion of nation building, something we'll continue to fight for, and of course, advocating for those who are in need of advocacy.
Thank you very much, Kibri. Vincent, closing thoughts?
It is very often said that Burnham was a man ahead of his time. It has occurred to me that that is not true. It is not true because the thoughts of Burnham, the ideas of Burnham, the works of Burnham are present and relevant today. So that if we dismiss this idea of him being ahead of his time, we put ourselves in a position to understand that he is present in his thoughts, he's present in the monuments which he created, and his thoughts can still impact national and international development. And in that regard, he was not ahead of his time because that time was his as much as this time is his, insofar as what he did is still evident. We're still beneficiaries of what he did today, and his thoughts can still guide us into the future. And so when we talk about his centennial anniversary, we also talk about him inspiring the future. Burnham was not ahead of his time. Burnham's thoughts were relevant yesterday. In fact, yesterday provided the environment for him to develop his thoughts. They are excellent today in things that we benefit from, and they're relevant to the future once we embrace them, because as Aubrey was saying, they're principles that he adumbrated, which can
Aubrey
still be
Norton?
used to take us forward.
I would say there's a myth about Burnham that I would like to dispel. And here I'm talking from my personal experience. people are of the view that we weren't critical of Burnham. Vincent will tell you the likes of Alexander, Ivla Griffith, Johnson, the many of us challenged the views put by Burnham. But Burnham was a man who listened. And at the end of it, he will give his perspectives. And invariably, he was so convincing, people tend to follow him. But I will say this, that the leader that engaged us the most as young people and actually spoke to us was Forbes Burnham. And there is something that Burnham said to us at one time when we were talking to Burnham about how we move forward politically. And I always remember he said this. He said, young man, y'all never fought for political power. So you all don't know the PPP. He said the first time you have to fight the PPP, you will understand political power. And I live to see that. And so I agree with Vincent. Burnham is still relevant. Burnham, like I have said, outlined policies and principles that can guide us. And we will continue to be guided by them, while at the same time being critical of those elements of Burnham that are negative. And as a political party, it is not our task to be criticizing Burnham in the public domain. But it is our task to analyze his strength, know his weaknesses, and utilize them as we move forward to develop clear positions as to where we are headed. Those will be my closing comments on Forbes Burnham.
Aubrey Norton, leader of the People's National Congress. There are some who are here questioning the fact that I am hosting a program on Burnham's 100th anniversary, given my own political history as a critic and one who struggled against the Burnham government. Those who take that position do not understand anything about a national development and do not understand anything about the evolution of our society. As one moves further and further away from a particular theater, one gets a broader view. And I think people of my persuasion have come to the conclusion, not only here in Guyana, but in other parts of our Caribbean, that after the clash and the concourse of ideas in the 1970s about whether pragmatism or transformational politics was the way to go, as we, 60 years after independence, look back at that, we can see ways and means of bringing all those perspectives together. Burnham is a product of our Guyana. So is Cheddi Jagan and Walter Rodney and UC Guyana, the four people who I think have had a profound effect on the political direction these last 60, 70 years. I think our Guyana would be incomplete in terms of our understanding of our place in the region and the world if we did not draw from the intellect and the perspective and the praxis of all of our leaders. We are poorer if we were to leave out a Jagan or a Burnham or a Rodney or a Guyana. We are richer when we bring them all together into this mix of the Independence Project. And the Independence Project is always about the ultimate freedom. The ultimate freedom. We may disagree. We disagree to this day, those who are supporters of these leaders. But we must be matured. We must, in 2023, on this 100th birth anniversary of Burnham, if we cannot, as a nation, we cannot, as people who aspire to be public spokespersons, if we cannot understand the dialectics of our being, then we are not fit to be speaking to people in public. I have absolutely no apologies to make to anyone for hosting this program and for my own comments and I'll end with this. I benefited from Burnham's education policy. Given where
David,
I came from.
David,
Yes.
I agree with you. We name all the left-wing leaders, but I do believe if we are going to get a balanced analysis, that Peter Degar's role acted as a mechanism to juxtapose the two positions, and I believe we should do more to analyze the role of Peter Degar, particularly between 1960 and 1968. I just wanted to make that point.
Point taken, point taken, point taken, point taken, point taken. And even somebody like a Desmond Hoyt, I think, didn't govern for too long, but that period is a critical period coming at the end of the Cold War and in the wake of the passing of the one who founded the People's National Congress and whose presence was so overwhelming in terms of our national thing. I was saying that I benefited from Burnham's education policy, even where I come from and where Vincent comes from and where you come from and where this young man comes from. But especially Vincent, you and I, of that generation, had it not been for Burnham's education policy, our lives may have turned out differently. None of us went to Queen's College or Bishops or St. Rose's or St. Stanislaus. But here we are today. And the difference was Burnham's education policy. I want to thank you all, brothers, for coming on tonight and for enriching this conversation. And I hope as the year progresses that we can have another conversation about Burnham and his contribution to our Guyana as we lift the veil off of our collective ignorance. We must engage every facet of our being. Thank you very much. Thank you, Vincent. Thank you, Aubrey. And thank you, young Kibwe. I have to have you back. As a young leader, you were quite articulate tonight, and I will have to bring you back on some of the other issues. And I want to thank you, the audience, for staying with us tonight. And as I always say, they think we make trouble here at nights. And you can attest by your presence that if it's trouble, it's good trouble. But we also want to be an example to those who are our detractors, to say that we understand political contestation, but we also understand what it is to build a national consciousness of who we are as a society. Thank you all very much. And tomorrow night, I think GHK Lal is going to be here, and we are going to be speaking truth to power.